For nearly 8 decades, two nations have stood at opposite ends of the world, separated by ideology, ambition, and 10,000 miles of ocean, yet so deeply entangled that the fate of humanity itself has rested on the choices made in their capitals. One rose from the ruins of revolution and civil war, forging itself into a superpower through sheer force of will and an iron grip over millions of lives. The other emerged from the Second World War as the undisputed champion of the free world, its factories humming, its soldiers triumphant, its flag planted on every horizon. But what happens when two giants refuse to yield? What happens when the balance of power between them stretches so thin that a single misread signal could incinerate civilization? This is not merely the story of politics or missiles or treaties. This is the story of how two nations shaped the modern world and how their rivalry continues to define it. To understand the balance of power between Russia and the United States, one must first understand how two nations that once stood side by side in the bloodiest war in human history managed to become, within just a few years, the most dangerous enemies the world had ever seen. The story begins not in 1945, when the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, but decades earlier, in the upheaval of revolution and ideology that would color every subsequent interaction between Moscow and Washington. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in October 1917, overthrowing the provisional government and declaring a new socialist state, the reaction in the West was immediate and visceral. The United States, still governed at the time by Woodrow Wilson, viewed the revolution with deep suspicion. Here was a government that had signed a separate peace with Germany, an act of betrayal that, from an Allied perspective, prolonged the war. Here was a government that openly declared itself the enemy of capitalism, of private property, of the very economic and political foundations upon which American democracy rested. Washington did not extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union until 1933, a gap of 16 years that spoke volumes about the mutual distrust embedded in the relationship from its very beginning. During those years, the United States was not passive. American troops were deployed to Russia as part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War, supporting the White Army against the Red Army in a conflict that killed millions. Though the intervention was modest in scale and ultimately unsuccessful, it left a permanent scar on Soviet memory. The Bolsheviks, and later Stalin, would never forget that the capitalist powers of the West had attempted to strangle their revolution in its cradle. That memory would become a cornerstone of Soviet foreign policy for generations. When Franklin D. Roosevelt extended diplomatic recognition to the USSR in 1933, he did so out of pragmatism. The Great Depression had hammered the American economy, and trade opportunities with the Soviet Union seemed promising. But normalization of relations did not mean normalization of attitudes. The purges that Stalin conducted throughout the 1930s, eliminating millions of real and imagined enemies, including the vast majority of the Red Army's senior officer corps, horrified Western observers and reinforced the image of the Soviet state as a brutal, irrational tyranny. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 changed the calculus entirely. Suddenly, Stalin's Russia was a necessary partner. The United States, through the Lend-Lease program, supplied the Soviet Union with enormous quantities of military equipment, food, and raw materials, over $11 billion worth before the war's end. Soviet and American soldiers shook hands at the Elbe River in April 1945. Their leaders met at Tehran and Yalta to carve up the post-war world. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed as though the two nations might find a way to coexist. But the wartime alliance was always a marriage of convenience, not conviction. At Yalta in February 1945, the tensions were already visible beneath the surface. Roosevelt, ill and perhaps overly optimistic, believed he could manage Stalin through personal diplomacy. Churchill, more realistic about Soviet intentions, pushed for firmer guarantees regarding Eastern Europe. Stalin, for his part, had one overriding objective: to ensure that the USSR would never again be vulnerable to invasion from the West. That meant buffer states. That meant Eastern Europe under Soviet control. The death of Roosevelt in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, brought Harry Truman to the White House. Truman was a different kind of leader, blunter, less patient with diplomatic ambiguity, and deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions. When he met Stalin at Potsdam in July 1945, the meeting was civil but cold. Truman had just learned of the successful test of the atomic bomb. He mentioned it to Stalin in passing, not knowing, or perhaps suspecting, that Soviet intelligence had already briefed the Soviet leader on the Manhattan Project through an extensive network of spies embedded within the American program. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war in the Pacific, but they opened a new chapter in the relationship between the two emerging superpowers. From a Soviet perspective, the bombs were not merely a weapon used against Japan. They were a signal directed at Moscow. The United States now possessed a destructive capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen, and for nearly 4 years, it possessed that capacity alone. Stalin responded by accelerating the Soviet nuclear program with ruthless urgency. The race had begun. As 1945 gave way to 1946, the wartime alliance disintegrated with breathtaking speed. Soviet troops remained in northern Iran in violation of agreements. Communist parties backed by Moscow gained influence across Eastern Europe. In March 1946, speaking at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman seated beside him on the stage, Winston Churchill delivered the phrase that would define an era: "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." It was not a declaration of war, but it was something close to it, a recognition that the world had divided into two camps and that the line between them was hardening. The American response took shape in the doctrine articulated by diplomat George Kennan in his famous long telegram of February 1946 and his subsequent X article published in 1947. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was driven by an ideological imperative toward expansion, but that it was not suicidal. It would retreat when confronted with firm, patient resistance. The policy of containment was born, not rollback, not war, but the steady, determined effort to prevent Soviet power from extending beyond its existing boundaries. It would be the guiding principle of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine had committed the United States to supporting free peoples resisting subjugation, a commitment that began with Greece and Turkey but was understood to extend wherever Soviet influence threatened to advance. The Marshall Plan, announced that same year, poured billions of dollars into the shattered economies of Western Europe, rebuilding them not merely out of generosity, but out of the strategic calculation that prosperous democracies were far less likely to fall to communism than desperate, impoverished ones. Stalin, understanding exactly what the Americans were doing, forbade the Eastern European states under his influence from accepting Marshall Plan aid. Then, in 1948, came the first great test of the emerging Cold War order. Stalin blockaded West Berlin, cutting off the city from the Western occupation zones in an attempt to force the Allies out of the former German capital. Truman's response was both ingenious and defiant. The Berlin airlift, a sustained operation that flew supplies into the besieged city for nearly a year, demonstrating American resolve without firing a single shot. Stalin, unwilling to risk a direct military confrontation, lifted the blockade in May 1949. That same year, two events transformed the strategic landscape. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, shattering America's nuclear monopoly years earlier than most Western analysts had predicted, a success made possible in part by intelligence provided by the spies who had penetrated the Manhattan Project. Then, in October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China, delivering to the communist bloc the world's most populous nation. In Washington, the question was agonized. Who lost China? In Moscow, the triumph was celebrated, though Stalin's relationship with Mao would prove far more complicated than Western observers assumed. By the end of 1949, the balance of power between Russia and the United States had taken the shape it would hold, with variations for the next 4 decades. Two superpowers, two ideologies, two nuclear arsenals growing year by year, and a world divided between them, waiting to see which vision of the future would prevail. The decade that followed the Soviet atomic test was perhaps the most dangerous in all of human history. Two nuclear-armed superpowers, separated by ideology and suspicion, each believing the other intended eventual conquest, competed for influence across every continent while their arsenals grew to the point of mutual, total annihilation. The balance of power between Russia and the United States during this period was not merely political or military. It was existential. The choices made by leaders in Washington and Moscow determined whether civilization itself would survive. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove south, was the first direct military test of the containment policy. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened to defend South Korea, and when American and Allied forces pushed north toward the Chinese border, China entered the conflict with hundreds of thousands of troops. What many in Washington had feared, direct confrontation with a communist power, had arrived, though the war remained a conventional conflict, constrained from expanding in a nuclear exchange by the mutual recognition of what that would mean. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding UN forces, publicly called for expanding the war, even hinting at the use of nuclear weapons against China. Truman, recognizing that MacArthur's approach risked a global conflagration, fired him in April 1951. It was a decision that cost Truman enormously in domestic political terms, but it reflected a crucial principle that would govern American strategy for decades. Even when fighting communism, the goal was to manage the conflict, not to risk nuclear annihilation. The Korean War ended in an armistice in 1953, leaving the peninsula divided almost exactly where it had begun, a costly, bloody stalemate that nonetheless demonstrated the limits of superpower confrontation. Stalin died in March 1953, and the question of who would succeed him set off a power struggle within the Soviet leadership that consumed the next several years. Nikita Khrushchev eventually emerged as the dominant figure, and he brought to Soviet foreign policy a personality that was simultaneously more flexible and more impulsive than his predecessor. Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, in which he denounced Stalin's crimes before the Communist Party Congress, sent shockwaves through the communist world. Revolutions erupted in Poland and Hungary. The Hungarian uprising was crushed by Soviet tanks in November 1956, a brutal reassertion of Moscow's control over its Eastern European satellites. The year 1957 brought a development that transformed the strategic balance in ways that no political negotiation could easily address. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, and in doing so demonstrated that it possessed rockets powerful enough to deliver nuclear warheads to targets anywhere on the planet. The psychological impact in the United States was staggering. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a warhead on New York, on Washington, on Chicago. The sense of American invulnerability, shielded by oceans and distance, evaporated overnight. The Sputnik moment accelerated the space race, the missile race, and a fundamental rethinking of American defense strategy. Billions were poured into education, particularly in science and mathematics. NASA was created. The U-2 spy plane program was expanded, sending high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft over Soviet territory to gather intelligence on missile sites and military installations. It was one of these U-2 flights that precipitated a major diplomatic crisis in May 1960, when pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. Eisenhower's initial denial that the aircraft was on a spy mission collapsed when the Soviets produced not only the wreckage of the plane, but Powers himself, captured alive. The resulting embarrassment wrecked a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev and deepened the mutual suspicion between the superpowers. John F. Kennedy entered the White House in January 1961 with a message of vigor and determination, but his early months were marked by setbacks. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in April 1961, an operation planned under Eisenhower and executed disastrously under Kennedy, sent CIA-trained Cuban exiles ashore in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, only to see them defeated within days. The humiliation was complete. Kennedy met Khrushchev in Vienna in June 1961, and the Soviet leader came away from the encounter convinced he was dealing with a young, inexperienced leader who could be pressured. In August 1961, East Germany, with Soviet backing, began constructing the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier that would divide the city for the next 28 years. The wall was, in one sense, an admission of failure. The communist system was unable to prevent its own people from fleeing west. Over 3 million East Germans had departed since 1945, including hundreds of thousands of the most educated and skilled workers. The wall stopped that hemorrhage, but at the cost of imprisoning an entire population and creating a symbol of division that would define the Cold War in the world's imagination. Then came October 1962, 13 days that brought humanity closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. American U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba revealed the presence of Soviet nuclear missile installations under construction, offensive weapons capable of striking most of the continental United States with little warning time. Kennedy convened a secret deliberative body, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, and for nearly 2 weeks, the world's fate hung in the balance as Washington and Moscow maneuvered on the edge of catastrophe. Kennedy chose a naval blockade, euphemistically called a quarantine, to avoid the legal implications of an act of war, around Cuba and demanded the removal of the missiles. Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment sailed toward the blockade line. In the Pentagon, military leaders pressed for airstrikes and an invasion of Cuba. Kennedy resisted. Soviet submarine commanders, out of contact with Moscow and under depth charge attack from American warships, debated whether to launch their nuclear torpedoes. One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize the launch, a decision that may have saved civilization. The crisis was resolved through a secret arrangement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans would pledge not to invade Cuba and would quietly remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Both leaders could claim a form of victory, but the experience had shaken them profoundly. A direct telephone hotline, the famous red phone, though it was actually a teletype connection, was established between Washington and Moscow to prevent future crises from escalating due to miscommunication. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, a first step toward arms control. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 brought Lyndon Johnson to power, and Johnson's presidency would be defined by the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam, a conflict rooted in the logic of containment but ultimately fatal to American strategic credibility. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were deployed in Vietnam. The country was convulsed by protest and division, and the promise of Johnson's Great Society had been consumed by the war. The Tet Offensive in January 1968, a massive coordinated assault by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, shattered American public confidence in the war's progress, even as it was, militarily, a tactical defeat for the attackers. Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. In Moscow, Khrushchev had been ousted in a coup by his own colleagues in October 1964, replaced by the more methodical and less mercurial Leonid Brezhnev. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968, crushing the reformist Prague Spring movement, established what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Socialist states would not be permitted to deviate from the Soviet model. The message to Eastern Europe was unambiguous. The message to the world was that the USSR, despite the humiliation of Cuba and the internal challenges of de-Stalinization, remained a power fully prepared to use military force to maintain its sphere of influence. By the end of the 1960s, the balance of power between Russia and the United States had reached a kind of terrible equilibrium, a condition that strategists called mutually assured destruction, with its uncomfortably apt acronym, MAD. Both sides now possessed enough nuclear warheads to destroy civilization many times over. Neither could strike first without guaranteeing its own annihilation in the retaliatory blow. The logic was horrifying, but it held. The world did not end. And from that recognition, that the competition would continue but that certain lines could not be crossed, a new era was about to emerge. If the 1950s and 1960s were defined by confrontation, crisis, and the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation, the 1970s brought something unexpected, a deliberate, if incomplete, relaxation of tensions between the two superpowers. Détente, from the French word for relaxation, was not peace, and it was not trust. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement by leaders on both sides that the costs of unrelenting confrontation were becoming unsustainable, and that certain areas of cooperation might serve the interests of both powers without requiring either to abandon its fundamental goals. The architect of American détente was Henry Kissinger, the German-born scholar and strategist who served as National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State under Presidents Nixon and Ford. Kissinger's approach to foreign policy was rooted in the European tradition of realpolitik, the belief that relations between states should be governed by the calculation of interests rather than the promotion of ideology. He argued that the Soviet Union and the United States, as the two dominant powers in an increasingly multipolar world, had a shared interest in stability that transcended their ideological differences. The opening to China, executed in 1972, was Kissinger's masterstroke. By establishing contact with Mao's China, then still a revolutionary state deeply hostile to both superpowers, Nixon and Kissinger exploited the Sino-Soviet split that had been growing since the late 1950s. Relations between Moscow and Beijing had deteriorated sharply, driven by ideological disagreements, territorial disputes along their shared border, and competition for leadership of the global communist movement. There had even been brief but bloody border clashes between Soviet and Chinese forces in 1969. By opening to China, the United States introduced a new strategic variable that complicated Soviet calculations enormously. Moscow now had to worry about a potential American-Chinese alignment to its east, even as it managed confrontation with NATO to its west. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I, concluded in May 1972, produced the first agreement between the superpowers to actually limit their nuclear arsenals, or more precisely, to limit the growth of certain categories of weapons. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, signed at the same time, prohibited both sides from deploying nationwide missile defense systems, enshrining the logic of mutually assured destruction as the cornerstone of strategic stability. The thinking was counterintuitive but sound. If neither side could defend itself against a retaliatory strike, neither side would dare launch a first strike. Nixon's resignation in August 1974, consumed by the Watergate scandal, weakened the American position at a critical moment. Gerald Ford, who succeeded him, pursued détente but lacked Nixon's political authority. The fall of Saigon in April 1975, with televised images of the last American helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof as North Vietnamese forces entered the city, was a shattering blow to American prestige and credibility. The greatest military power in history had been fought to a standstill by a small agrarian country, and the consequences for American self-confidence and strategic posture were profound. Yet the mid-1970s also brought Soviet overextension. The Brezhnev era, increasingly referred to by Soviet citizens themselves as the period of stagnation, was marked by a sclerotic political system, an economy unable to compete technologically with the West, and a leadership that was physically as well as intellectually aging. The Soviet Union was exporting revolution and maintaining client states across Africa, Asia, and Latin America at enormous cost that a fundamentally inefficient, centrally planned economy could not indefinitely sustain. Jimmy Carter, who entered the White House in January 1977, brought a different emphasis to the competition with the Soviet Union. Where Nixon and Kissinger had been willing to work with authoritarian governments as long as they served American strategic interests, Carter emphasized human rights as a cornerstone of American foreign policy. He sharply criticized Soviet treatment of dissidents. Figures like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn had brought the brutalities of the Soviet system to world attention and linked the relationship with Moscow to Soviet behavior toward its own citizens. Moscow responded with fury, viewing this as crude interference in internal affairs. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 ended the détente era definitively. Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan to support a struggling communist government against a growing Islamist insurgency, the Mujahideen. Carter responded by withdrawing the SALT II treaty from Senate consideration. It had already been struggling toward ratification, imposing a grain embargo on the Soviet Union, boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and authorizing covert support for the Afghan resistance through the CIA. The invasion was the greatest Soviet strategic overreach since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it would prove far more costly. Ronald Reagan, who succeeded Carter in January 1981, brought to the White House a fundamentally different view of the Soviet Union than any of his predecessors. Where Nixon and Carter had accepted détente as a form of managed coexistence, Reagan believed that the Soviet Union was not merely a rival, but an evil empire, morally illegitimate, economically unsustainable, and ultimately defeatable. His strategy combined a massive military buildup, covert support for anti-communist movements around the world, the Reagan Doctrine, and economic pressure designed to strain the Soviet system to its breaking point. The centerpiece of Reagan's military strategy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in March 1983, popularly known as Star Wars, a proposed system of space-based missile defenses that, if realized, would render the Soviet nuclear arsenal ineffective. The Soviets took it far more seriously than many Western skeptics did. Even the possibility that the Americans might develop an effective missile defense system threatened to overturn the strategic balance that the ABM Treaty had enshrined. Soviet military planners, unable to match American technological investment dollar for dollar, faced the nightmare scenario of an American first strike capability combined with a defensive shield against retaliation. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Moscow, and the world changed. Gorbachev was unlike any previous Soviet leader. Younger, more flexible, genuinely troubled by the system he had inherited. He introduced two programs that would ultimately transform and then destroy the Soviet state: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. His goal was to reform the Soviet system, to make it more efficient and more legitimate, not to end it. But the forces he unleashed proved impossible to control. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, was the first arms control agreement to actually eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons, a remarkable achievement that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. The two leaders met multiple times, and their relationship, cautious at first, developed into something approaching genuine mutual respect. Reagan, the man who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire, stood in Red Square in 1988 and told reporters he didn't think that phrase applied anymore. By 1989, the Eastern European order that Stalin had constructed was dissolving with breathtaking speed. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border with Austria. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution swept the communists from power. And then, on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. East German authorities, overwhelmed by popular pressure and receiving no instruction to use force, opened the checkpoints. Crowds from both sides attacked the wall with hammers and pickaxes, and a symbol of 4 decades of division came down in a single night. The Soviet Union itself began to fracture. Independence movements surged in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, and the Caucasus. The August 1991 coup attempt by hardliners against Gorbachev failed, but it also ended what remained of his authority. Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of Russia, stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building and rallied opposition to the coup, a moment that symbolized the new reality. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist. The Cold War was over. The balance of power between Russia and the United States had shifted in the most dramatic way imaginable. And the question of what would come next, for both countries and for the world, remained entirely unanswered. When the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin on Christmas Day, 1991, many in Washington believed the great competition was over. Francis Fukuyama had declared the end of history, the triumph of liberal democracy and market capitalism as the final form of human political organization. The United States stood alone as the world's sole superpower, a condition unprecedented in the modern era. Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, was economically devastated, politically chaotic, and militarily diminished. The balance of power had tipped so completely that it no longer seemed to be a balance at all. The 1990s in Russia were a decade of extraordinary suffering. Shock therapy, the rapid, often brutal transition from a planned economy to a market economy, produced catastrophic results for ordinary Russians. Inflation wiped out savings. Privatization, conducted without adequate legal or institutional frameworks, allowed well-connected insiders to seize vast national assets for virtually nothing, creating the oligarchic class that would define Russian capitalism for decades. Life expectancy for Russian men dropped precipitously. Birth rates fell. The military, starved of funding, deteriorated to a degree that shocked even its own commanders. Boris Yeltsin's government, despite its democratic pretensions, struggled to maintain control. The attempted coup of 1993, when Yeltsin used tanks to shell the Russian parliament, illustrated how fragile the new democratic order actually was. The First Chechen War, launched in 1994 and ending in humiliating defeat for Russian forces by 1996, demonstrated how far the once mighty Red Army had fallen. Russia was no longer a superpower in any meaningful military sense. It was a state struggling to hold itself together. In Washington, the Clinton administration faced the challenge of defining American purpose in a world suddenly lacking the organizing principle of anti-communism. NATO expanded eastward, incorporating Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999, a decision that was welcomed in the newly liberated states of Eastern Europe, but viewed with deep alarm and resentment in Moscow. Russian officials, including Gorbachev himself, would later claim that Western leaders had given informal assurances that NATO would not expand into the former Soviet sphere. Western officials denied any such commitment existed in writing. The argument over what was or was not promised in those early post-Cold War years remains one of the most bitterly contested historical disputes in contemporary international relations. The Kosovo War of 1999 sharpened Russian resentment further. NATO's air campaign against Yugoslavia, conducted without United Nations Security Council authorization, where Russia wielded a veto, was justified on humanitarian grounds, but perceived in Moscow as the West acting unilaterally to intervene in a sovereign state's internal affairs. Russian troops made a dramatic dash to Pristina Airport in an attempt to establish a Russian presence in the peacekeeping operation, only to be denied overflight rights by neighboring states and find themselves isolated. It was a moment of humiliation that a different Russia would not forget. Vladimir Putin became president of Russia on the last day of 1999, and from the beginning, he represented something categorically different from the chaotic Yeltsin era. A former KGB officer who had served in East Germany during the Cold War, Putin viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, not, as he was careful to specify, because he wished to restore Soviet communism, but because it had left tens of millions of Russians outside the borders of their homeland and had destroyed Russia's status as a great power. Restoring that status was his central and unwavering objective. Putin's early years benefited from soaring oil prices, which filled Russian coffers and funded both the reconsolidation of state power and the modernization of the military. He brought the oligarchs to heel. Those who cooperated were allowed to keep their wealth. Those who challenged him politically, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky of Yukos, found themselves imprisoned. The media was gradually brought under state control. The political opposition was marginalized. Russia was becoming more stable in the narrow sense that its state functioned more effectively, but it was doing so by abandoning the democratic aspirations of the early 1990s. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, created a brief, extraordinary moment of potential rapprochement. Putin was the first foreign leader to call President George W. Bush with condolences, and Russia provided genuine intelligence assistance for the American campaign in Afghanistan. Bush, famously, looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul. For a few months, it appeared that the two countries might build a genuinely cooperative relationship based on the shared threat of Islamist terrorism. It did not last. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003, again without UN Security Council authorization, was strongly opposed by Russia, France, and Germany, an unusual alignment that spoke to the depth of concern about American unilateralism. The color revolutions that swept through several former Soviet republics, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, were seen in Moscow not as spontaneous democratic uprisings, but as American-backed attempts to undermine Russian influence in its near abroad. Putin's response was to frame domestic politics increasingly in terms of resisting Western interference. The 2008 war in Georgia was the first direct military action Russia had taken against a neighboring state since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Russian forces drove Georgian troops from South Ossetia, a breakaway region whose independence Russia then recognized. The conflict lasted 5 days, but signaled clearly that Russia was prepared to use military force to defend what it regarded as its vital interests. The George W. Bush administration, already stretched thin by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, was unable to offer Georgia more than verbal support. Barack Obama's reset policy sought to rebuild the relationship, and it produced genuine achievements. The New START Treaty of 2010 further reduced strategic nuclear arsenals, and Russia provided cooperation on the Iranian nuclear negotiations. But the reset foundered on the dynamics of Russian domestic politics. The protests that erupted in Moscow in 2011 and 2012, following parliamentary elections widely seen as fraudulent, were viewed by Putin as Western-inspired. When he returned to the presidency in 2012 after a term as prime minister, he brought with him a harder, more nationalistic approach to both domestic politics and foreign policy. The crisis in Ukraine that began in 2013 and escalated through 2014 shattered what remained of the post-Cold War European security order. When Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych rejected an association agreement with the European Union under pressure from Moscow and turned instead toward a Russian economic integration project, mass protests erupted on the Maidan Square in Kyiv. The protests ultimately forced Yanukovych from power in February 2014. Russia responded with stunning speed. Within weeks, unmarked Russian special forces, the Little Green Men, had occupied Crimea, which was then annexed by Russia following a referendum dismissed by Western governments as illegitimate. Simultaneously, Russian support fueled a separatist war in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region that would grind on for years, killing thousands. The West responded with sanctions, increasingly severe economic penalties that cut Russia off from Western financial markets, targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, and placed asset freezes and travel bans on named individuals. Russia countered with retaliatory sanctions on Western food imports. The economic damage was real on both sides, but not severe enough to change Russian policy. Oil prices fell sharply in 2014, compounding the damage, and the Russian economy entered recession. But Putin's domestic approval ratings soared. The nationalistic framing of the conflict resonated with a Russian public that had nursed grievances about post-Cold War humiliations for 2 decades. Russia's military intervention in Syria in September 2015 demonstrated that Putin was prepared to deploy military power far beyond Russia's immediate neighborhood, restoring the image of Russia as a global power capable of decisive action. An image that stood in contrast to what Moscow depicted as American indecision and retreat. Russia's intervention reversed the military fortunes of Bashar al-Assad's government and ensured the survival of a Russian client state, while establishing new military footholds in the Middle East. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine launched by Russia in February 2022 was the most dramatic rupture in the post-Cold War European order. Putin's stated objectives, the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, obscured what was in essence an attempt to eliminate Ukraine as an independent state aligned with the West. The Ukrainian resistance, fierce and effective far beyond most military analysts' early predictions, transformed what Russian planners apparently expected to be a rapid operation into a prolonged and costly war. Western nations, led by the United States and including NATO members across Europe, provided Ukraine with billions of dollars in military and economic assistance, imposing the most sweeping sanctions regime ever applied to a major economy. The war reshaped the balance of power in ways that continue to unfold. NATO, which had been pronounced brain dead by French President Macron in 2019 and was struggling to define its purpose, found renewed unity and relevance. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral, joined the alliance. Russia's military, despite its quantitative advantages, revealed significant weaknesses in logistics, command, coordination, and morale. But Russia's nuclear arsenal remained intact, and Putin's willingness to issue thinly veiled nuclear threats complicated Western decision-making at every step. The balance of power between Russia and the United States in the mid-2020s is neither the bipolar standoff of the Cold War nor the unchallenged American unipolarity of the 1990s. It is something more complicated, a multipolar world in which China's rise has introduced a new strategic variable of immense consequence, in which nuclear deterrence still holds, but its logic is being tested, and in which the rules-based international order built after 1945 is under stress from multiple directions simultaneously. Russia is diminished relative to its Soviet predecessor, but it remains a nuclear power of the first rank, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and a state with the will and capability to challenge Western interests across a broad front. The United States remains the world's leading military and economic power, but it faces domestic political divisions, questions about the sustainability of its global commitments, and the challenge of managing competition with China while simultaneously supporting Ukraine against Russia. The balance of power, as it has always been, is not a fixed thing. It shifts with technology, with economics, with leadership, with will, and with the unpredictable contingencies of history. What remains constant is the stakes. In a world bristling with nuclear weapons, the consequences of miscalculation remain, as they have been since 1945, potentially civilizational.